Okay, so returning to this talk here, I think that the energy crisis of 1973 and this kind of reorientation, it brought attention back to a lot of different issues and subjects in American society, but also kind of reoriented old subjects and issues. In particular, nature, the environment, is something that's, I think, worth discussing in this context. Say that, recall that the wilderness is often presented as the original scene of American democracy. That was the kind of pioneering heritage, the idea that it was on the frontier in the wilderness, that the idea of the American individual is allowed to reach full expression and development, so away from institutional centers of power. At the same time, in the capitalist vision of America, the wilderness was there to be exploited, mined, and transformed into a modern industrial state. So you have a little bit of that contrast working there. On the one hand, there's this extolling of the virtues of the untapped wilderness, the place that has never been seen before, never been encountered before, something that somebody can encounter for the very first time, as in Emerson's vision of it. But on the other hand, all of this stuff, all of this nature is just here to be put to use as timber, lumber, petroleum, metal, whatever it might be, converted into agricultural land or converted into city centers. And we need to lay railroad tracks and highways and all of that stuff. So there's that kind of balance, you could say, there. In a sense, this process was complete by the latter part of the 20th century. In other words, the process of rampant industrialization and urbanization. It had almost just kind of run its course, and now we have the full development of the American machine-like modern nation state. And so that, as I say, it kind of calls to mind an old topic, which is, what is the place of nature and the environment within the modern nation state? We should almost start from just the simple question of whether nature or the wilderness truly does exist as such anymore. If you take the wilderness to be that places where people have never been previously, I don't know how many pockets of those actually exist in America. It's also worth noting that the kinds of versions of nature and the environment that have become familiar to America are not really part of the wilderness anymore. I mean, here you have a kind of classic example, Mount Rushmore in South Dakota, with the president's heads carved into the side of it, Washington, Jefferson, Roosevelt, and Lincoln. There's always talk about adding another president's head to the mountain, but I don't think they can. I don't think the integrity of the rock will allow them to do that. And also the other thing which has been brought up is it's just a sculpture about a moment in American history. It's not really just this big homage that we just keep building on over time. No, I mean, it's complete as it is. But here you have an instance of the scenes of natural splendor in America, which are often carefully constructed tourist destinations. The Grand Canyon is a kind of another example of that, and various other national parks in America, which are scenes of incredible natural splendor, and yet they're really kind of caught up in the modern nation-state apparatus, right? They're the kinds of places where you drive along a highway with your entire family to reach them, and once you get there, there are railings setting up, or there's signposts or gift shops or all that stuff. It's all kind of structured within this larger urban web in a way. And so it starts to become this question of where exactly do we find a real nature, real wilderness? Does it even exist as such anymore? I mean, when you think about the United States, it might not even be a good idea to seek out a place that really does seem uninhabited and devoid of people, because chances are that's exactly where they were doing like nuclear tests or something like that, right? Oh, I'll go out right out into the desert. Nobody's ever been here before. Wait, why are the radiation levels so high out here? As well, yeah, because nobody's here. That's the exact reason that they're using it for whatever different kind of test or kind of policy they have in mind. So too with the kinds of anxieties about the environment. We're very adept now at measuring pollution levels, levels of toxin in the air and the water. And there is this sense, I would say, of the human presence. And here it takes us beyond America to a kind of global scale. The human presence just kind of seeping and bleeding into everything, right? There's the kind of idea that modern industrial society has just infiltrated everything around the world, and we can't really find anywhere anymore that's just free from us, free from the stuff that we do, free from our presence. And I would say America is one of the kinds of original homes of that sort of idea. One other thing I should mention about that too, remember suburbia, which I brought up last time, kind of plays that role as well. A scene of nature, or it's supposed to kind of create the impression of a natural environment, except it's not nature, actually. It's a residential neighborhood, which is designed to make you feel like you're in a park. This takes us a little bit, beyond America. It's more of a kind of global perspective. But I would say there's perhaps an entire perspective on nature that exists in a 20th century and contemporary context. It's a view almost of the earth itself, which is really, I would say, a product of this capitalist paradigm. The notion that the earth itself is basically a reservoir of resources and energy. Imagine if you think of the earth, the entire planet in that way. It's just this kind of globe, this ball of a teeming energy and stuff that we can mine and make use of and tap into and organize and streamline and stockpile, that the earth is just rich in these things that we can convert for our own ends. I mean, that really has become that sort of 20th century perspective. It's the notion of taking everything the earth has to offer, as I say, stockpiling it or kind of arranging it in these big stacks so we can make use of it at a later date. But also, of course, that fuels the anxiety that the earth is going to kind of expire on us or run out over time. It's almost become one of the prevailing images of environmental catastrophe. Again, like the grains of sand through an hourglass, that the earth is just this kind of finite reservoir that we're steadily depleting over time until it will eventually collapse and take us with it. So a kind of a view, a sort of calamitous view of the future, which has come to the fore since, well, basically the 1970s, I would say. To the 1980s and the end of the Cold War, because this is the era in which the Cold War comes to an end. From Carter to Reagan, we'll pick up with the story of what happened subsequently with Nixon. Hollywood politics and the neoliberal machine, and the collapse of the Soviet Union, which happened in 1991. You see Jimmy Carter, President of the United States from 1977 to 81, successor to Nixon, although it was the Vice President, Gerald Ford, who took over when Richard Nixon resigned. But Ford was, generally speaking, an unpopular person. Thus, the Democratic candidate gets elected instead, and probably elected because he was in some ways a ideal counterpart to Nixon, a kind of moralizing, born-again Christian type, and an outsider to the Washington, D.C. establishment as well. But I think when you look at the years immediately after Nixon, there seems to have been this anxiety about restoring trust in American government. And Carter seemed to be the kind of honest, upstanding person who could perhaps do that. I guess Carter is still alive today. He's another one of those people who's just living forever. He seemed to play that role very well. But note that it was this idea of restoring trust in the U.S. political system without actually addressing the problems within it. I mean, this, I think, became the entire story, because you look, again, the Watergate scandal, and how endemic do those issues, those problems appear to be. As I mentioned before, political leaders trying to weaponize or make use of the institutions, the apparatuses of American government. I mean, look at it in the contemporary context. You have Donald Trump with his, quote, perfect phone calls to various people as he tries to destroy his political opponents or find votes or dig up dirt on the president's son or whatever he's doing. And now on the other side, he's finally apparently going to be arrested for the porn star. I guess that's what they've landed on as the charge that they're going to level against him. I mean, these are clearly developing issues as far back as the 70s, did they do anything about it? Did they actually address the root causes of these problems? Or did they simply try to find somebody who can sort of present a face or an image that is going to secure people's trust in the system, their faith in the system? Well, Carter's presidency only lasted for a single term. Might have been his role as an outsider that kind of led to various deadlocks within Congress. That might have been part of it. But, economic problems. That was really the bigger issue that America was presiding over in the latter part of the 1970s. The sense that the country was no longer growing and prospering as it once had. The successor was Ronald Reagan, Republican Ronald Reagan, President of the United States from 81 to 89. So here is the person who presides over the 1980s and even kind of extends his reign as well, because it was his vice president, the other George Bush, George H.W. Bush, who gets elected subsequently before being ousted by Clinton. Ronald Reagan, here was someone who had just a few convictions, we would say. He wasn't really along the lines of Carter, a really kind of erudite or introspective person. It was really just, a couple of big ideals, and that's really all you need in a political leader. And the kind of finer points and details are just superfluous. They don't really matter. Certainly setting a trend for Republican candidates subsequently. George W. Bush was another person who was exactly like that, right? Just a couple of ideals, and the kind of finer points and details are totally irrelevant. Well, here were Ronald Reagan's ideals. The removal of big government. So there's a big one for the American Republicans for a long time. The U.S. government is intrusive, interfering, and you should have a leaner version of the U.S. government to protect this idea of individual rights. The slashing of taxes, again, a big one in the Republican kind of corporate economic agenda. The best way to get the economy moving is through the reduction of taxes across the board. The investment in the military, which he certainly did repeatedly over the course of the 80s, building new weapons, proposing new kind of missile defense systems, investing in the nuclear weapons program, and the defeat of communism as well, which became kind of the top end of his agenda, almost a return to the 1950s in a way, in the sense of the fear of the ideology of communism, the idea that this was really hostile to American principles and values. And that too was deliberate, because during times of hardship in America, there's this tendency to look backwards and try to restore an earlier period, try to restore that kind of lost glory from a previous era. He was an actor. He was someone who appeared in various Hollywood films from the late 1930s and early 1940s. He was actually a star in the early 1940s as well. There you see him playing a cowboy. I forget how many films he was in, but it was quite a few during his heyday. And this, I think, is relevant as well, because he seemed to accelerate a process that was already happening in American culture, and again, is totally endemic today. Basically defines contemporary American politics. The blurring of distinctions between actors and politicians and the entertainment industry and politics. Well, we might have always been aware of this to a certain extent, but it became increasingly true in the 1980s that politicians are basically character actors underneath it all. So it's not really about the individual's policies or ideas or beliefs or values. They might have none of them as far as we're concerned. No, it's just you get to the podium and you put on a performance for the press. And that's essentially what it amounts to. It's a kind of rhetorical exercise, just delivering a speech and capturing the right tone and delivering the right notes. And the speech, such as it is, might say absolutely nothing, right? But that's beside the point. It's just about this kind of image presentation of unity and confidence and leadership. So that, I would say, the idea of Reagan being an actor, well, it was a very fitting training ground to become president of the U.S. And also this blurring of the entertainment industry and politics. Again, something that we've seen just escalate steadily over time. Not just in the sense of, Hollywood actors wading in with their various political views and ideas, but also the notion that contemporary American politics is like reality TV. That it basically is this kind of entertainment industry product, this kind of muckraking, sensationalistic story of constant sniping, fighting back and forth, and it's all just being put on for the purposes of entertaining people. So that's basically its underlying agenda, and the actual policies, the values, the ideas, those things are totally beside the point. You think about the kind of idea of the press conference today, or, for instance, the public debate, the presidential debate. And here we have something that there's a long tradition here of making use of public spaces for discussion and debate and for delivering speeches. For instance, you can talk about the existence of public spaces and the democratic ideal all the way back to the time of ancient Greece, where you'd have this public space, you have a bunch of people involved there, and perhaps you'd have two people or maybe even more engaged in a debate or a dialogue about the issues of the day, and this would be how they are trying to resolve some sort of pressing problem within their society. Well, you do have debates in American politics, but they're scripted debates. And half the time, they don't actually address any of the issues at all. There's just this kind of talking around of the issues, and it's really just about insulting one's opponent and drumming up as much sensationalistic entertainment as possible, or reading off a teleprompter, or doing everything except having a real legitimate dialogue with people, just filtering into the performance. So what actually happened with Reagan anyway? What were the policies, such as they were, that were implemented in American society at the time? Well, precisely the ones that I mentioned, cutting taxes, reducing the scale of the government, investing in the military, and trying to defeat communism. Probably the legacy of Ronald Reagan that stands out the most is the introduction of so-called Reaganomics, so Reagan's economics. I'm not sure if he had really a kind of in-depth economic plan, but it was certainly a period associated with, yes, the reduction of taxes and this corporatization of America, the kind of return of the big mega corporation, which makes outsized profits and is supposed to benefit the surrounding society. You see Trump, certainly a figure of the 1980s with Trump Tower, and he's someone who obviously still lives in a kind of 1980s mentality, at least when it comes to the economy. There was the uneven rejuvenation of city centers. Remember I said that with the eruption of suburbia in the immediate post-war context, you had this kind of flight from city centers that occurred where suddenly you had these very sharp divides between city centers and the outlying suburbs. Well, in the 1980s, you had more people returning to city centers, and that's been the story. You look at major cities in the United States, such as New York City or Chicago. There are certainly places where people live and work, and there's a lot of what we would call heterogeneity. I mean, a lot of different people there. But it was an uneven rejuvenation in the sense that this really gave birth to the kind of structure of the modern American city, where you have a lot of what you might call heterotopia, which in some respects means you have a lot of very wealthy people and a lot of very poor people living close together. And they're all kind of in the same space. You have a lot of homelessness, for instance, but you also have a lot of very rich people living in their condos. And they all kind of pass along the same streets. They're all kind of in the same zone. So this isn't the kind of rigidly segregated society. No, it's one where people are all intermingling, but there isn't really that sense that they are overlapping with each other. It's almost like these parallel streams that never intersect. That's the kind of idea of the modern American city, I would say. This kind of sharp division along class boundaries, racial boundaries as well, to an extent. and trickle-down economics, the idea that if you want a prosperous society, what you need to do is have rich people making a lot of money. I mean, that's basically the idea that it's bound on, hence the tax cuts and the focus on corporations. Just make the wealthiest people wealthier, whoever they might be, and eventually the money just trickles all the way down the system to the middle-class people and the poor people, because wealth is a good thing. I mean, that's basically the notion behind it. I would say that has been the prevailing American economic policy since the 1980s. It's just all about prosperity as linked to a very small, wealthy echelon of people, super managers, multi-billionaires, CEOs, corporate leaders, people like that. Say there, a period of growing disparities between the rich and the poor, which have continued in the United States to this day. That's where you see that taking hold. New forms of stratification, that means different hierarchies, founded on processes of privatization. The privatization of so many institutions and sectors of American society. We've talked for years in the United States about a private health care, for instance, and Obamacare obviously was meant to address the fact that was leaving a huge number of people out in the cold. This idea of two-tiered healthcare systems that are dependent on the level of wealth for someone. But how about the education system in America as well? How hierarchical and stratified is that? And founded on this idea of privatization. Private universities that charge, $50,000 a year, $60,000 a year in tuition. And we've seen the stories repeatedly come up over the years with so many of those big brand name universities. Your wealth and your family connections are the two big factors in terms of allowing you to enter the system. And that is pervasive all the way through the American education system, down to the grade school level, I would basically say, as these feeder systems into different class strata in American society. Underfunded, in many cases destitute, public schools and ultra-wealthy private schools, which do nothing but propagate continuing segregation and inequality in U.S. society. Kind of ersatz pragmatism prevailed at the time. Pragmatism, which is an American philosophy, but we think of pragmatism just in the kind of casual sense. As long as something works, then there's no reason to bother changing it. And that's the kind of idea of the 1980s. Well, the economy seems to be picking up, which it was doing. There was more prosperity at this time. Well, as long as it's working, we don't really need to examine it very closely, right? Just allow the system to continue on this upward path. Again, how established is that within American society today, especially in the economy? As long as the economy is growing and the stock market is booming, we better not look at it too closely. We better not kind of look a gift horse in the mouth. All of this led up to a stock market crash in 1987, a major stock market crash, a little bit forgotten in history, actually, for reasons I'm going to get into, but this kind of oversupply, overproduction, that was part of it. Also, some people have pointed to the coming of the digital age as being a factor here as well, which continues to be debated. Mentioned that a little bit shortly. This was right around the time where personal computers were becoming more of a thing, people using computers, including in trading and exchanges. They say there, the 80s seem to cement a type of neoliberal, make the rich richer agenda in American society that has never been seriously threatened since. I would say that that's become the kind of prevailing sort of socioeconomic policy in America. The only person who really seemed to be truly oppositional to that was Bernie Sanders, the Democrat candidate in the previous two elections, because there was a political candidate who was talking openly about things like socialism and public education, so not having tuition fees, different ideas like that about the Wall Street crooks, as he called them as well. Very unusual to hear an American politician speak in those terms, although not so unusual in various other countries around the world. But you look at the administrations that have followed, and they seem to have shared that basic neoliberal kind of capitalist free market style agenda. And to me, it doesn't really matter what side of the aisle we're talking about. You just see variations of the same perspective, whether we're talking about Reagan, Bush, Clinton, the other Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden. I mean, they all seem to have bought into this make the rich richer agenda as being the kind of basis for American growth and prosperity. There you see a kind of consumer product, an image of the 1980s, because this was an era of new consumer products as well. Lamborghini Countach, which, I mean, if you grew up at that time in the 80s, then you'd recognize this car because every kid in the world had a poster of this car on his bedroom wall as this kind of symbol of the excess, the exuberance of the era. Of course, you talk about modern cars today like the Bugattis, Koenigseggs, the Pagani Huayra. They have nothing on the kind of mystique of the Lamborghini Countach. I can't convey to you the kind of ethos of this car, because keep in mind, this was the pre-internet age as well. So you couldn't just go and look up a video of something if you were interested in it. You typically would never see this car except on a poster or in magazine images. So it only kind of increased the sort of mythology that swirled around it for a long time. And I think kind of built up that ideal, even if the car itself was probably terrible to drive, right? As people would report later on. Famously has absolutely no visibility out the rear because of the giant wings and all the kind of different add-on additions. But then, of course, the idea with the Lamborghini Countach is, why do you need to see what's behind you, right? Step on the gas and go. Stock market crash of 1987 and Reaganomics in general might have had kind of much different consequences in the future. I mean, certainly for the election of, say, George H.W. Bush in 1988, except that the Ronald Reagan administration, and indeed, I would say the entire kind of American paradigm, got a tremendous gift towards the end of the 1980s, which was basically a victory in the Cold War. And I say it was a gift because the Americans didn't really win the Cold War as such, although that's the way they've kind of framed it in retrospect. No, what happened was the Soviet Union broke apart. I mean, that's essentially what ended this period of tension and conflict. But of course, the United States has sort of advocated this idea of its personal triumph in this period. Certainly the major event of the latter part of the 20th century, something that happened over the 1980s up until 1991, and given the importance of the Cold War and this conflict to American society, this is worth pausing over to see what happened here. Now you have Mikhail Gorbachev, leader of the Soviet Union from 1985 to 1991, officially General Secretary of the Communist Party. That was essentially his title, and the last leader of the Soviet Union before the demise of the country in 91. Gorbachev inherited a situation which was worse than America's situation, effectively, although you could point to some of the same issues. Economic stagnation, which had been going on for a long time, discontent, certainly among the people, an ossified party apparatus, meaning kind of stale and frozen and unchanging, and widespread corruption, cronyism within the party, but also the Soviet Union's simple inability to deliver consumer products to people had fueled a massive black market, which flourished at the time within the USSR. There was this sense that if you want consumer products, whatever they might be, from food to clothing to anything in between, well, you have to look for it on illegal trading markets because you're not going to get anything through the official channels. I would say, too, there was the larger issue within the Soviet Union, which was the continuous repression that existed in the society, which precisely snuffed out grassroots movements. There was repression in America, but remember the counterculture movement that occurs in the 1960s. That's a kind of unleashing of youthful energy and vitality and rebellion and dissident, and certainly the powers to be in the U.S. government and just in mainstream culture don't like the counterculture movement, but to a degree they had to live with it. There wasn't really anything they could do to just stamp it out altogether. They could conduct surveillance, they could arrest people as they did, but the movement caught hold because it was a grassroots mobilization movement, and it had an impact on American society and culture. It changed the workings within the society. That kind of mass counterculture movement was exactly the kind of thing that the USSR did not have in the 60s and 70s. Yeah, of course, there's a lot of rebellion and dissent within the system, but it catching on to that level? Well, no, because the Soviet Union is designed to quash instances of that kind of rebellion within society. So the mobilization never reaches that level. But consequently, what happens? Well, you lose the possibilities of energy and dissent. You lose the possibilities of actually changing things, because that's what those movements can do. They can change society in a positive direction. So that contributed to the basic stagnation within the Soviet system, and Gorbachev enters into it, deciding that he's going to institute changes. And so he promoted these two ideas, which became famous in the English lexicon due to their importance at the time. Ideas of perestroika, reconstructing the Soviet system, and glasnost, openness or transparency within the government. And to the surprise of many Western commentators, he not only talked about those things, but actually began implementing them over the course of the latter part of the 1980s. Well, perestroika and glasnost actually turned out to be precursors to the disintegration, the collapse of the Soviet Union as a country. You see a representation of a street, the main road in Leningrad, or St. Petersburg, during the 1980s. Western commentators often present the breakup of the Soviet Union as inevitable. That's a kind of story that has circled around since this happened, which is a kind of a little bit of selective rewriting of history, because it really actually took most people by surprise. I'm talking here about observers in America and parts of Europe too. The fact of the matter is, people have this idea that the disintegration of the Soviet Union was basically caused by Gorbachev's attempts to reform it. That's part of that old story, that the most perilous time for a bad government is when it tries to reform itself, because then it basically opens the way for dissent. Well, that probably is true. It is a dangerous time. And there's also this idea that Gorbachev's goal of reforming the Soviet Union, of actually turning it into a functioning socialist society that was going to live up to the ideals of equality and fairness, that his goal of trying to turn the Soviet Union into that society was futile, hopeless, and doomed to failure from the start. Well, not necessarily. I mean, that's not strictly true, because one thing we have to keep in mind, and this is true of, I think, most countries when you look at the trajectory of their history, is that the Soviet Union had undergone a lot of changes since its founding. I mean, the revolution had occurred in 1917, and it had undergone numerous transformations over the decades. I mean, you go from the revolutionary state, the kind of experimental phase in the early 1920s, war, communism. You have Stalinism in the 1930s, this kind of a draconian police state that takes hold. But then, after the war, you have a kind of thaw within the Soviet Union. It's not the same kind of Stalinist regime. It's not a free society, but freer than it was. And so there are all these different transitions that had occurred over many years. And there was really no reason why the USSR couldn't undergo a new transition to a new state. That potentially could have happened at this time. And the proof of which is China provides another example of that, because there you have the Chinese Communist Party did survive as the ruling power of that country. But how has China changed over the last decades or so? You go back to the era of the Great Famine in China or the Cultural Revolution in the 60s. What a different country it is today, even though the ruling party ideology remains the same. So there was nothing really kind of inevitable about this happening. Thus, we need to study a little bit the question of why exactly it did happen. We see Soviet tanks helping to crush the Prague Spring in 1968. And this story takes us into the relationship between the USSR and its surrounding countries, but also the relationship to its own republics. The liberating international dimension of communism had long been forgotten by this point, and that was indeed the kind of ideal of communism during the days of Vladimir Lenin, for instance. Remember when he was advocating for international global revolution? The idea that communism would not be consigned to just Russia, but would spread all across the world, well, that idea was basically killed off quite quickly. By the time we get to the 1930s, we have this idea of socialism in one state, the Soviet Union as its individual entity. There was still a kind of international dimension, but it was more the idea of various communist states, communist regimes that would be favorable to the Soviet Union, such as existed in Eastern Europe after the end of the Second World War, places like Czechoslovakia and Poland, among others. So what happened with the Prague Spring in 1968? Well, this was an instance in which a communist regime in Czechoslovakia attempted to reform itself. He had a new political leader, and he introduces some new reforms that are aimed at kind of democratizing the workings of society, making it freer than it has been. Not completely free, but freer than it had been previously. And there were grumblings from over in the east, but Czechoslovakia pushes forward with reforms. There's more in the way of grassroots mobilization. And then the Soviet Union and other members of the Warsaw Pact refers to the military alliance in Eastern Europe. They basically quash this movement. They put it down, crush it, send in the tanks, roll back the reforms of the Prague Spring. I say there that this event, more than any, seemed to emphasize the repressive, conformist, and imperialist elements of the communist regimes in Eastern Europe as a whole. Imperialist in the sense that the Soviet Union was the empire. It was the kind of central power there that had enforced its own policies and interests and style of government all across Eastern Europe. And nothing kind of emphasizes that idea more than sending in your military if you start to see a country showing signs of breaking away from your sphere of influence. So that kind of imperialist dimension, which was so central to Soviet identity, was really, I would say, strengthened and entrenched in 1968. We're almost out of time, so I won't talk about this slide today. We'll come back to this, finish up with the rest of the late 20th century next week's class, and continue on into the 21st century.